The Destruction of Black Civilization, Part 10. Before the 16th century, most Africans on the continent had never seen a real white face. Since in many societies all devils and other evil spirits were white, the ritual to ward off these always led by chanting dancers whose faces and bodies were hideously painted with white chalk. That there were in fact white humans, living white devils, was unbelievable. Probably few reports are better known than those of first contact with the boldest of the unbelievers would venture to rub the skin of whites to see if the paint would come off. Over 1,000 years had passed since Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, and Turks had taken over Egypt, and Arabs now also ruled the eastern Sudan. Arab Hebrew rule was steadfast in isolated Abyssinia, while the Arabs along the east coast, operating from their Zanzibar stronghold, had not themselves ventured far into the interior. Their Afro-Arab agents generally spearheaded slave hunting operations. Ghana and Mali had disappeared, and now Songhai was making its last stand against Arab, colored, and Berber armies from across the desert. Even there where black armies clashed with invading white armies, the masses never saw white people. This refers not only to the countless thousands who fled upon the approach of enemy troops, but also to those who remained scattered over the country in their villages. Now things were changing rapidly, and the people were becoming sharply aware that they were being hemmed in from all directions. To begin with, the Arabs were spreading out and penetrating formerly forbidden borders of black states. They could therefore enter black territory from which whites were barred. These black Arabs, many were unmixed, confused African leaders everywhere, increased the tension and tribal wars among them, and helped mightily in destroying the independence of African states. Having discussed this in connection with the fall of the Mossi states and elsewhere, my return to the same subject again is to keep a focus on the race self-imposed chains as well as on those imposed by whites. A further reason is that blacks themselves do not like to discuss these internal handicaps at all, not even among themselves. We prefer to pretend that certain things do not exist. This fact in itself is a weakness that strengthens the white power position over the blacks. The Portuguese were the first Europeans people to arrive in the West and Central Africa. They were not long in adopting the Arab strategy in dividing the blacks against themselves, a strategy since adopted by all white people. The Congo-Angola story. The Portuguese arrived at the mouth of the Great Congo River in West Africa in 1488. Their aim was to make their tiny European state into a vast African Indian empire. They had two men of vision to inspire and all-out efforts to realize the dream: Joao I and his son, Henry. Africa had been secure from invasions from this quarter because the Western world had believed that the earth was flat. Now the myth had been exploded when in 1434, Gil Enos dared to sail beyond the area where the Atlantic Ocean was supposed to end, and ships plunged into the void. He sailed around Cape Bojador. Thenceforth, the blacks of West Africa had to confront the white devils from Europe and the Americas. The Portuguese, as ignorant of the African people as they had been about the shape of the earth, were not prepared to find highly advanced states there. The Kingdom of the Congo was their first great surprise because its political structure and expertly organized administrative machinery equaled that of Portugal or any other European state known to them. That system requires no discussion here because it followed the same constitutional pattern as that of the other African states already described. The Congo's economic system of agriculture and handicraft industries, organized into guilds, was the same. Apprenticeship training for all skilled occupations was the same, and the general pattern of social organization was also the same as other African societies. The Congo Kingdom was prosperous, carrying on external trade by both land and rivers with states farther north, east, and west. The states to the south, later to become Angola, were in an uneasy commotion due to the increasing presence of foreigners on the coast, on nearby islands, and now sailing up the rivers toward the interior. Migrations from Angola states increased, even through the Portuguese, even though the Portuguese were then bypassing the region in favor of more highly advanced kingdoms of the Congo. Was it the flight of so many potential slaves from the coastal acres that caused the Portuguese to move up the river closer to the population centers? It was more likely a strategic move. By establishing a stronghold in the Congo Kingdom, the Angolan region would rather be caught between Portuguese armed forces and the Angolan northern border, and those on the seacoast and offshore islands. In short, Portugal was getting in a position to take over this whole region of black states. Many historians and apologists for Portuguese imperialism in Africa use the Congo Kingdom as the classic example of the Portuguese policy of racial equality, for they did not themselves declare this to be their policy. And did not the King of Portugal himself address the King of Congo as brother? What happened was that the Portuguese captains had met Congo leaders, not just the king, who were in fact not only their equal, but men so anxious to advance their nation further that they were willing for anything new and better than the white world had to offer. They took the Westerners at their word. They had painted their monarch as the greatest king in a world that had advanced to a pinnacle of civilization under the guidance of a universal religion that was headed by a supreme pontiff who was appointed by the Son of God himself. Moreover, the same successor to the first head of the church, the Apostle Peter, would not only welcome the King of Congo and his people in the great Christian fold, but would send missionaries and teachers to help make the kingdom the greatest in Africa. Portuguese records indicate that far more than religion and Western education was offered. Material benefits, such as great wealth from trade, were persuasive. The Kingdom of Congo, therefore, is a study case of the process of westernizing the very first group of blacks on the African continent. This, however, was only one of the means to a much greater end. Nothing could have been further from the Portugal's real objective than bringing Christianity and a higher civilization to Africa. Christian civilization served as the charm words in which the white man's magic with the incantations which hypnotized both his victims and himself. They believed that they were being introduced to a better life, while the latter convinced himself that even the enslaved people were better off under the white standard for civilization, besides which there was no other. He was therefore serving God himself in Africa, for did not the churches throughout the Western world so proclaim? And were not the Christian missionaries the most effective servants of empire? The court at Lisbon had planned well for such a mini-state as Portugal, an ambition for an empire bigger than the continent of Europe, and then daring enough to operate that plan. This must compel a degree of admiration for the kind of Caucasian genius and uninhibited aggressiveness that enable very small groups of men to go forth and dominate almost all the people on this planet. Portugal's presence in West and Central Africa aimed at nothing less than building an empire across Africa from west to the east, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Indian Ocean. a vast swath across the continent that will also serve directly as the imperial highway connection with the projected Indian Empire. The African Indian Empire was Portugal's grand design. The Congo interlude was merely a needed stepping stone and base of operations. But they were smart enough to realize that the foundation for a permanent empire in the land of another people, built with their own sweat and blood, would be more successful if the minds of the people could be captured first. One did not go in with guns blazing. Only fools did this, except in cases where the natives were too damn smart and saw through every scheme. No matter how shiny the cross or how white the extended hand, in such cases it was their own fault. Yet for their own salvation, that Christian cannons had to blast away. First of all, however, the really big thing was to change the blacks into the white man's image, a process previously mentioned which caused blacks to reject and become ashamed of both their culture and themselves, the only people on earth to do so. This is why it is important to have a close-up look at the process of westernization in the Kingdom of Congo, where it began. The missionaries began their work on kings and notables. There was nothing new in this approach. Indeed, the Congolese were so anxious for the new education and its vehicle, Christianity, that the priests found their task easy. First of all, to become a Christian, one had to be baptized and given a Christian name. Christian names were Western names, and they all took the form used in the conquering country. The first Congolese king to become a Christian was Nzinga Kuwu in 1492, taking the Portuguese name of Jaho I. Hundreds of other blacks immediately followed his examples. Prince, chiefs, ministers, and some of the masses. The most notable Congolese kings who became black Portuguese were Afonso Alvarez, Dom Pedros, Diagos, etc. Overbearing Jesuit fathers were installed as counselors to the king, one functioning as a prime minister. This move at once destroyed the troublesome tradition council that controlled chiefs and kings. With such councils, no European power could operate. The age of absolutism, with the rise of the nation state in Europe, was directly reflected in the Congo kingdom. With this Portuguese wedge between the king and the people, the Congo rulers now found themselves free to make important decisions without references to black counselors. They therefore tended to become absolute monarchs insofar as their own people were concerned, but generally puppets in the hands of Europeans. The exceptions were Afonso I and Diogo I. The idea of divine kinship was promoted throughout the anointment and crownings of kings by Portuguese bishops. Kings now ruled as sons of the church, chosen by divine decree to serve it. This meant that serving Portuguese, by meeting their demands, always made as friendly suggestions from brothers who were equal in Christ. Even the traditional political system was made to appear as a Portuguese creation. It was already highly and efficiently organized before any Europeans came. Organized with each village and town under a chief called Mani, each district under a Mani, and each of the 6 major provinces that made up the kingdom was under the administration of a governor, also bearing the title of Mani. Now, in addition to the widespread use of Portuguese names, important Portuguese titles appears, such as dukes and infantes, a new class of prince, hitherto never used in Africa because the Western conception of royalty was absent. Here, then, is another case where the external influences. Schools have a field day, since nothing is better known and nowhere denied than the fact that the Africans who adopted European or Asian institutions, such as Islam and Christianity, for example, were not only influenced by them, but often transformed into black Arabs, black Portuguese, black Frenchmen, black Englishmen, and so on. In fact, it was a very transforming external influence that played a decisive role in first destroying the best in African civilization, while at the same time giving worldwide publicity to all remaining elements of barbarism that could be found. The new masters of the continent were in the position of all power and could therefore make their viewpoints the viewpoints of the world. The system of reducing blacks to non-persons was so thoroughgoing that not only did the various people of the world regard them as such, but tragedies of tragedies, the blacks themselves came to feel inferior and to hate themselves and all of their kind. Magic. Here indeed a magical thing had happened since these whites who called themselves Portuguese had arrived. As the 15th century moved on toward the 19th century, the Europeans became less and less white devils and more white masters, backed up by an awesome firepower. White was no longer the face of evil in the black world. It had changed places with black. Now black was the badge of evil. All that was bad, even bad luck. To make a white man look evil, you had to dress him in black. Life's final tragedies, death, called for mourning in black. Happy events such as baptism and weddings required the wearing of white. God himself, being white, had cursed the blacks and made them the servants of man. Man being white man, for was not he made in the image of God? To worship God, in effect, was to worship the white man. A volume could be written on the scores of these little psychological gimmicks that are now so deeply embedded in cultural thought that they are taken as simple a matter of course and require no comment. Yet they are the subtle weapons which have been more devastating in conquering the blacks and reducing them to an inferior status than armed might. Caucasian victory was complete and seemingly permanent when the blacks throughout the world joined the whites in glorifying all things white and condemning all things black, or even tinged with black, including themselves. Here we are at the very heart of the race problem. This self-abnegation, self-effacement, the loss of self-identity, by cutting their roots with the past and thereby losing the very links with their history from which a people draw strength and inspiration to move forward even higher ground, and in fact the reason for being. In short, in the incongruous attempts to replace his own values with those of the white man, the black man lost his own personality and therefore his manhood almost absolutely. Nearly 500 years have passed since the first Europeans landed on the coast of West Africa, and their phase of transforming blacks from men to half men began. Yet even with this long background, there are countless millions of frustrated blacks, frustrated by the perpetual annoyance of the blurred vision and the blank wall as they struggle to see life through the lens of the blue eyes of the Caucasian. The status of African people throughout the world remains too precarious to deal with their history by merely chronicling important events. The situation demands that greater efforts be made to determine the meaning of those events, their effect on the people, the overall change in the direction of history, and what new direction the race must take. The major and immediate Portuguese aim in Africa was not the conquest of blacks. Rather, their first aim was to destroy Arab power in Africa and the Islamic control of just about all of the overland trade routes to the east. For this cause, Columbus had sailed, and other Europeans took to the high seas. The Portuguese sought to use religion as the usual spearhead. That Christian states were in Africa from the earliest times had not been completely forgotten. One that had escaped Muslim destruction was located in what had been a southern eastern border state of the ancient Ethiopian Empire, identified by the Portuguese as a kingdom ruled by a King Prester John. The idea was to unite the Christian forces of Europe with those of Africa in an all-out war against the Arabs. But what was not generally known was that the kingdom of Aksum, expanding to become the empire of Abyssinia, was ruled alternatively by Christian Arabs and colored Christian Hebrews. All Arabs were not Muslims. All Hebrews were not Jews in religion. It appears that African Hebrew and Christian Arab communities were in southern Arabia and Yemen, just across from the East African country they later conquered. The Portuguese, however, did not teach the African Christian kingdom at that time that they sought it for the promotion of their campaign against Islam. They had therefore begun to work of creating a black Christian kingdom in their own image. This was Congo. By 1512, no one needed to guess or speculated about the Portuguese plans. Their King Manuel made them clear in documentary form. The Regimento. This was one of the interesting and significant documents in the history of black people because it was the first detailed blueprint for the conquest of the black man's mind, acculturation via Christianity, his body, slavery, and his country. This historic document, however, was couched in all of the endearing words and phraseology of equality and brotherly love, from which fact historians have declared the Portuguese African policy to be one of equality replete with humanitarianism. But the Congolese king, Afonso, his Portuguese name notwithstanding, saw through the elaborate plan to reorganize his country and began to throw up roadblocks. Albeit too late, Manuel levied on the king a heavy tribute in slaves, ivory, and copper to pay the cost of his Christian civilization program in the country, his various expeditions there, and for the huge expenses in connection with the education of a few Congolese children in Portugal, including the king's son. Manuel's next most important move was to make certain that his Code de Congo was carried out. He therefore sent Ao de Silva, both of his ambassadors, and in effect governor general or viceroy to the Congo, while Simão de Silva's real functions were clearly outlined. These were covered by the usual title of courtesy, advisor to the king or king's counselor. In this capacity, he was co-administrator of the nation, a supreme judge, and had control over army and finance. He was to have a comprehensive geographical survey of the country to determine the extent of its natural wealth for direct exploitation. Things quickly got out of hand. The Portuguese settler population, based mainly on the coast and offshore islands, desired the quicker riches that would flow from the increasing demand for black slaves. The settlers therefore pursued a more aggressive course of action, ignoring Lisbon's court attempt to cover up the real operations with the friendly language of diplomacy. Up to the 16th century, the people we are calling slaves were not slaves in the modern sense, but laborers either captured as prisoners of war or persons in prisons for various offenses. During the first stage of the slave trade, many African chiefs and kings actually thought they were supplying workers needed abroad and at a great profit to themselves. They had not had experience with the white man's slave system or its equation with race. Not at first, we have said, but as the decades pass, the Congo state is a good example. Many Africans became enmeshed in the horrors of the trade, knew what they were doing, and in the pursuit of guns and riches became as brutal as the whites in dealing with their own kind. Guns. Black leaders saw these new weapons of death as a source of the white man's power and the immediate threat to their own existence. The earth-shaking cannons that were being brought into Africa seemed to herald the death of a whole race or its total enslavement. The Africans became insistent in their demands for guns as articles of trade. There was then, as now, a silent embargo on arms to black Africa, a sort of white gentleman's agreement. The demand for guns by the chiefs was pitted against the demand for slaves by the Europeans and Arabs. The Arab slavers had no trouble securing firearms. The chiefs could seriously hamper the trade if their demands for guns were not met. Besides, many slave traders were quick to see that the supply of slaves would double and triple if firearms were given to certain strategically located kingdoms and chiefdoms, for these would then seek to become big, wealthy powers, expanding their territories over weaker black states and capturing millions of prisoners to be enslaved in the process. The more aggressive traders were willing to arm such African states as one of the risks capitalists must take in the pursuit of wealth. The more imperialist-minded saw an outcome even more important. That is, it would be built in motivation for perpetual warfare among blacks themselves, creating an everlasting hatred between groups, destroying every basis for unity, and above all, firearms would keep them so busily hating and fighting each other that they would forget their real enemies, the white devils from the sea. The Portuguese Christianization of the Congo created something more than chaos. It was a revolting mess. No matter from what the angle it was viewed, to begin with, priests were not only among their leading slave traders, but also owned slave ships to carry the black cargoes to distant lands. Priests also had their harems of black girls, some having as many as 20 each. They were called house servants by these holy fathers. The great majority of whites were the scum of the land from which they came. Even the half-educated priests were generally of the very lowest character, morally and otherwise. The slave situation became more and more desperate and out of hand as every white man down to the lowly worker became a trader. The builders sent over to erect fortifications and other permanent installations for the Portuguese, stone and brick masons, carpenters, engineers, painters, metal, and other craftsmen were all slave traders, and unskilled Portuguese laborers had their own quotas of slaves, especially slave girls. For let this truth emerge from the many facts which are buried, and let it stand out clearly. One of the main attractions that drew thousands of white men was the unlimited sexual freedom with all the black girls and women who were enslaved and helpless in the power of their masters. These wholesale raids on black womanhood continued to swell the mulatto population, the majority of which, as in the case of Egypt and the Sudan, became the faithful servants and loyal representatives of the conquering races to which their fathers belonged. The Congolese king Alfonso found himself in the middle of fires from several directions and hamstrung by the Portuguese advisor who had acquired veto power even over the king's action. Yet Alfonso was far from being a weakling. He tried, too late to gain control over the slave trade, a control now most urgent because every black that competing raiders could get their hands on was enslaved, including some members of the royal household and numerous title holders throughout the country. On the other hand, the King of Portugal declared a royal monopoly over the trade. This not only frustrated Alfonso's efforts, but clashed head-on with the interests of the powerful and independent slave merchants, the real controlling settlers on the seacoast and islands. These were the representative of the great chartered companies that controlled the commerce of the world, since they operated under the royal characters, and the court was a principal shareholder in all such enterprises. They could not openly defy the king, but the distance from Lisbon enabled them to bypass De Silva and any other representative of the king and carried on as they wished. The mission's fathers, the war dogs of the Lord, Jesus, were most helpful as spearheads into the interior chiefdoms to form slave hunting alliances in exchange for discarded guns. For those who require the specific detail and example of how just advancing black states were destroyed throughout the African continent and want the facts repeated over and over again, here then is still another example in both Angola and the Kingdom of Congo. The strategy for destruction seldom varied, giving added weight to my concept of a grand Caucasian consensus on matters conquering non-white peoples. The aspect now under discussion was the practice of having white groups spread out over the country into the various provinces, heavily landed with gifts of goodwill, and getting themselves attached to the course of local chiefs as friendly advisors who were going to guarantee the security of the chiefs and their people, and even extend their power over other peoples, all of which would mean great riches for the chiefs. A few old guns replacing spears seemed to be sufficient evidence that these whites were indeed saviors as well as friends. The French name for them was agent provocateurs. The American name would have been CIA or AID. No matter how strong and effective the administrative machinery of the central government at San Salvador had been, it was being undermined and destroyed by the well-planned European activities in the provinces. The identical activities that had been carried on in the Egyptian provinces there 3,000 years before in Cuba and would be repeated all over Africa. The aim was to provoke war between the blacks, pitting the gun-armed groups against who only had shields and spears, and thus skyrocketing the number of captives for slavery from a few thousands into millions. Not only were whole villages destroyed, but entire provinces were depopulated, and their formerly proud and free citizens were marched off in chains, collared and joined together by heavy poles, as though the chains that bruised and bonds hands and ankles were not enough. Many royal lineages were among the captives, including chiefs, which is exactly how it should have been if any of the people were to be enslaved. According to African tradition, leader and people were one and the same, sharing a common lot. This sense of oneness, however, applied only to the members of one's tribe and not to Africans outside of it, another tragic fact of black history. This is why the chiefs and kings would secure prisoners of war by attacking other states. Only a savage chieftain would sell his own people into slavery. The European learned this very quickly and found it fitted in well with the general plan to keep the blacks divided, forever suspicious of each other, and to have these mutual hatreds and suspicions historically derived not from anything the Europeans had done, but from the blacks' own record of tribal warfare. As the slave raids spread throughout Angola and Congo, the blacks continued to flee overland and up the rivers toward the central and southern areas of the great savanna regions and the lakes. Some, as we have seen in the case of Cuba, found security long enough to rebuild remarkable states again. Others found security only in the hidden recesses of decay and decline. Meanwhile, the fierce Jaga warriors were still on a rampage, fighting with or against any group, including white slave traders. But since the Jaga generally waged war only against their own kind, Africans, the Portuguese were less hesitant in supplying them with guns. The wars to capture slaves had become so widespread among and within the various states, and the slave trails to the coast were so heavy with barefooted traffic that it is difficult to see why any alliances with the Jaga were needed. unless it was thought to be necessary to make up for the unbelievable deaths toll among the captives. For every 2 million blacks enslaved, over 1 million died. The record indicates rather clearly than many preferred death to slavery. I just said the record indicate. But you will never find a single Portuguese, Dutch, Spanish, English, or American document that explicitly says any such things. The archives in Lisbon are rich to overflowing with African documents going back 500 years. By wading through a great mass of such written records, the historian often gets a picture that was not intended for painting and messages from the same documents which were not sent, which is merely another way of saying again that the written documents often reveal far more than their authors intended. You would therefore search in vain for an account written as the following: it is not true that all women and even children were likewise marched and changed. This would have been unnecessarily anyway, because we had learned that these black women are so loyal to their men that they will follow them even into hell. Capture their men and you did not have to capture them. Yet many of these same women would seek death directly by attacking us and our armed guards. These, of course, were beaten and chained the same as male slaves. Another problem was a large number of suicides during the 200-mile trek to the slave pens on the coast. The greatest number died from poison, which hundreds of women would conceal in their bodies for the purpose, passing it to friends and kinsmen in the darkness of the night before giving it to their children and finally taking it themselves. All this slowed us down during the night when we should have moved faster because it was cooler. Yet the dead and the dying had to have their chains chopped off from the living. Many babies were deliberately smothered to death by their dying mothers. We do not believe that other deaths were caused by the long march as some allege, for while it is true that we ourselves are carried in hammocks, the bearers changed every 10 or 15 miles. The biggest and strongest boys are selected to carry us. They are usually between 20 and 30 years old. They also collapse sometimes, but only 5 have died during this year. It must be remembered that these blacks are quite used to walking very long distances with heavy burdens. There are many problems in this business. The captains, taking it too easy on the coast, are always complaining about our slow movement and the many weeks it takes on the march. They never take into account how much we are slowed down by trampling and stumbling over skeletons and rotten and dead bodies of slaves that went along these trails before us, sometimes years before us. The stench of those who died recently is unbearable, yet we bear it. We also lose much time trying to find routes free of the dead and dying. Then there are scores and scores of perfectly healthy blacks who drop dead without any apparent cause. Some say they die out of sheer spite, another way of defeating us. We work in fear, for our guns are often useless in the increasing numbers of ambush attacks along these death-ridden trails. And while the Congolese kings now harass us in their attempts to check the spread of the trade, the real danger is in the Angola region, the region of the Black Terror in the form of death-defying Black Queen Anne Nzinga. Who ever heard of a woman general leading her armies in person? The truth is that she is the greatest military strategist that ever confronted the armed forces of Portugal. Her tactics kept our commanders sweating in confusion and dismay. Her end, and what alarms us most, she has developed a system of infiltrating our black troops with her own men, causing whole companies to rebel, desert, and join her armies in what she calls a war of liberation. Portuguese casualties are always heavier than reported, for she stages surprise attacks with lightning speed, always aiming first to capture guns and cannons. And while we now surround ourselves with armed guards on these long marches, we never know how many of our black soldiers are the Queen's own men. This would have been a true account up to 1663, when the 40 years of unremitting warfare that Queen Nzinga waged against the Portuguese to free Angola ended with her passing. Africa had lost her greatest daughter, the slaves, their greatest emancipator. Where is this explicitly written? Nowhere. It has been pointed out that Afonso was himself a statesman and far from being a mere puppet in the hands of the Portuguese. Even though the process got underway with his conversion to Christianity and the replacement of his own African name with a Portuguese one, he was awakened by the cold and began to resist and reject those provisions which were designed to make Africans black Portuguese in the name of Christ, while destroying their sovereignty at the same time. The fact that the enemy prevailed in the end does not detract from his stature as the great African. The pressures had increased as Portuguese riches from the slave trade, far from satisfying their greed, led them into excited riches for gold, silver, copper, and lead they believed to be in abundance in the region, but concealed by the blacks. Pressures from the African population increased with the widespread of slave hunts and raids. Historians have highlighted the role of African chiefs and kings in the slave trade. Little is said about the general African opposition to the trade or about the kings and chiefs who led the fight against it. Yet, by the very nature of the situation, these had to be as well known as by the blacks who enriched themselves from the traffic. Queen Nzinga was not the only African abolitionist. It just happened that in her case, she was not only involved in treaty negotiations of record, but operated over so many Angolan areas that she could not easily be excluded from history. The Congolese opposing their kings were fighting both slavery and the Christian church that promoted it. Even the broader education that they all passionately desired turned out to be a farce, another Western bait. The schools, rigidly restricted in number and attendance, were little more than Catholic classes under semi-literate priests who were themselves not only slave dealers, but the personification of all that is meant by corruption and immorality. Of all of Afonso's effort to get at least one good school established in the Congo was blocked. For one thing, widespread education of the blacks was not really intended. That would have meant sending well-trained teachers instead of unwanted dregs of Portuguese society. But even if Portugal had the best intentions, she herself did not have many educated men in the 16th century, and her own illiterate masses were just as ignorant as those in the rest of Europe. The situation had become worse on all fronts when Diogo became king of Congo in 1545, supported by Lisbon court factions that could still make or break kings and influence their policies. On the other hand, the powerful trader population had their principal strongholds at the strategic Luanda and Sao Tome, from which points they continued to expand slave operations in, below, around, and beyond the Congo, all in defiance of Congolese kings and the king of Portugal himself. They were greatly aided by the king Angola of Ndongo, the strongest state in the Angola region. But Ndongo was nominally under the Congo as a tributary state. In 1556, war between the major conflicting groups, hitherto undercover, broke out open and full scale. Royal Portuguese forces allied with those of Congo against Portuguese trader forces that allied with Ndongo. Portuguese against Portuguese and Africans against Africans. So it appeared on paper in the records. The simple truth is that it was a war on Africans against Africans with the Portuguese forces safely in the rear. The black troops were to be used in all dangerous situations, and white lives safeguarded whenever possible. Was no silent gentleman's agreement or an aspect of the Grand Caucasian Consensus. It was rather an explicit royal decree from Lisbon, but it was so very unnecessary, this royal order, to put blacks in the front lines of battle. This would have been done anyway as a matter of course. The Congolese were defeated, and Ndongo and slave traders now controlled the whole trade. And although the war waged against them was instigated by Lisbon and directed by Manuel's own representatives in the Congo, the victorious traders used Ndongo for negotiations, leading to a new alliance with Lisbon and the foundation for taking over all of Angola as a colony of Portugal. Even the Portuguese counselors to Diogo could not deny any responsibility for the disaster with a straight face. Yet when Diogo died 5 years later in 1561, they were still actively on the job to choose his successor, thus promoting further turmoil in the already disintegrating nation. The murder of one king after another became almost routine. Attacks from enemy neighbors, quick to take advantage of the royal weaklings, and internal chaos marked the declining years of the Congo as a great power. Jaga warriors almost gave it a death blow in 1568, but not quite. Things moved rapidly. In 1575, Angola became a colony of Portugal by a royal decree. Only the mother Congo, fighting for her own life, could only weep at the permanent loss of her greatest offspring. But does not the very mention of 1575 as the year Angola became a Portuguese possession, does this not seem to be sort of closing the book on the most important events prior to and after 1575, making it appear that the Congo near collapse led to an almost immediate and easy takeover of Angola as a colony? This is the way historians generally read it. Well, it was not that way at all. The disintegration of the Congolese state seemed to be complete, but it was not. There was still another revival under another line of great kings, and although the conquest of Angola was ordered by Lisbon in 1571 and began in 1575, the Portuguese, to their great surprise, had to fight the longest and bloodiest war, almost foot by foot, before Angola was finally taken nearly a half a century later. They had not counted on being confronted with a black queen who would turn out to be one of the bravest generals that ever commanded an army. They had not counted on the new queen of Ndongo, Anne Nzinga. Queen Nzinga, the Unconquerable. Greatness was born out of the savage oppression of the Africans, and out of that oppression it grew like a giant. Just why the Portuguese drew so much blood with the lash from already chained and helpless slave is beyond all human understanding, since, if for no other reason, the victims were articles of commerce and the source of the very richest slaves sought. Besides, over half of the captured blacks died before reaching their destination. Self-interest then should have stayed in the murderous hands of the slavers. Nothing did, and the fact was, one of the reasons that Queen Nzinga said that the real savages in Africa were the whites. They created the conditions that brought her to her full. The Portuguese were so aggressive in their program of dividing the blacks and keeping them from among themselves that they overshot the mark, simply went too far. The system of spreading out over the country into the provinces and allying themselves with the various chiefs has been mentioned more than once, but after 1608, the commander-in-chief of the Portuguese army had tightened the noose. This was Bento Cardoso. Under his plan, Angola was to be further depopulated by a massive onslaught for slaves through a closely coordinated system in which every chief in the land would be owned by a Portuguese and directly responsible to him for a status quo of slaves. This would bypass the Angolan king of Ndongo, to whom the provincial chiefs paid their taxes and slaves. This will also mean increased warfare between the chiefdoms in order to meet the increased quotas demanded by raiding into each other's territories. Chiefs failing to secure the required number of slaves were themselves enslaved. Over 100 chiefs and other notables were sold into slavery in a single year, and another 100 murdered by Portuguese. We may safely assume that the actual number of chiefs enslaved or murdered was greater than the state above, since the Portuguese, like other nations, generally cut casualties figures for the record. The situation to be considered here, however, is the widespread confusion and terror among a hunted and leaderless people. To make matters even worse, if it was possible, the half-savage Jaga, who would join anybody for their favorite game of looting and raping, became allies of Cardoso. The Angolan king, who had been cooperating with the slave raiders, now saw himself being ruined on all fronts, losing his people and his profits. He therefore began to resist the Portuguese. The people, even though they knew that their king himself was a slaver, in sheer desperation, flocked to support the war of resistance. It paid off. Both the Portuguese and the Jaga allies were checked, and the war dragged on for year after year. After Cabaça, the capital city, fell to the Portuguese, their losses had become so heavy that the new governor had been sent from Lisbon with firm orders to complete the conquest of Angola once and for all. Nevertheless, was forced to sue for peace without victory. The Portuguese had suffered a disastrous defeat by the blacks, but the official version and excuse was that there was general illness in the ranks. Yet the Portuguese insisted on holding Cabaça. The Africans therefore rejected peace proposals as a trick, and the war was resumed in a land of famine where food crops and slave trade itself had come to a standstill. In the desperate state of affairs, the fighting somehow continued, with both sides obviously weakened in a disarray. It was during this period in 1619 that a new Portuguese commander managed to murder over 100 chiefs. At this point, the Pope intervened, insisting that the whole slaughter be ended and peace be pursued. In 1622, a new governor was sent from Lisbon to make peace. Portugal had been appointing governors of Angola for over 40 years without having control over it. The peace conference was held at Luanda. The black delegation was headed by the country's ablest and most uncompromising diplomat, Anne Nzinga, not yet queen but sister of the king, the woman power behind a weak king, and the one responsible for inspiring the people to continue the war of resistance when every hope was gone, unless she herself had been their last hope. But even before the peace conference began, and at the risk of wrecking it, the governor's Caucasian arrogance could not be restrained. He had decided on a studied insult at the onset by providing chairs in the conference room only for himself and his counselors, with the idea of forcing the black princess to stand humbly before his noble presence. He remained seated, of course, staring hardly as she entered the room. She took in the situation at a glance with a contemptuous smile. With her attendants moved with a swiftness that seemed to suggest that they had anticipated the stupid behavior by the Portuguese, they quickly rolled out the beautifully designed royal carpet they had brought before Nzinga, after which one of them went down on all fours and expertly formed himself into a royal throne, upon which the princess sat easily without being a strain on her devoted follower. Yet she rose at regular intervals, knowing that other attendants were vying for her honor and thus giving to these whites still another defeat. I gather from the indifferent ways this incident was reported that the Western mind is unable to grasp its real meaning. Some historians saw it as a cruel and inhumane use of slaves, ignoring the fact that Nzinga's chief claim to fame was that she was the greatest abolitionist of slavery, that she herself had no slaves and indeed had not the slightest need for any. One reason might be that she was so much loved and even blindly followed by her people that it was believed that all would die, to the last man and woman following her leadership. Such were the men not slaves, who gladly formed a human couch before the astonished Portuguese for their leader. She faced the Portuguese governor and spoke as a ruler of the land, and not as a subject of the King of Portugal. She did not recognize the man in the big chair as governor because she did not recognize the existence of a Portuguese colony of Angola. She only saw before her what her people had seen approaching their shores over 100 years before: pompous white devils bent on the destruction of non-white world. The Indingo terms for peace were presented as uncompromising demands, and it was clear from the beginning that the Portuguese would have fared better with a man. Before any treaty was signed, Portugal had to agree to evacuate Cabaça and all nearby fortifications. 2. The Portuguese were to wage war against the Jaga, since the Jaga had been Portugal's allies in trying to crush Indongo. 3. All chiefs who had become vassals of the Portuguese were to be free and enabled to return to former tributary status at home. And finally, the important concession Nzinga made was to return the Portuguese prisoners of war she held. The Treaty of 1622 was supposed to end all fighting in the whole West Central region, but the governor, as though to make up for his defeat in the peace negotiations with Nzinga, marched off almost immediately to invade Congo again. The treaty then became dead insofar as its execution was concerned, but Nzinga's brother died the next year and she became Queen of Indongo. The distressed Portuguese, in order to discredit her, put out the story that she had poisoned him, and while there was no evidence or any basis at all for the concoction, historians have shown that unbiased objectivity by faithfully carrying on the charge for over 300 years. Yet, if lying is a legitimate aspect of warfare, the Portuguese may have left justified in trying to destroy such an implacable foe in any way that they could. The greatest trouble was yet to come. Nzinga became queen in 1623 and went into action at once. Her first major move was to end an ultimatum to the Portuguese authorities demanding the immediate execution of the terms of the treaty, otherwise war would be declared. While the Portuguese were preparing to meet the Queen's armies, the Dutch fleet appeared as a new threat. The Dutch themselves, great slavers, certainly did not come as liberators of the hard-pressed blacks. Their aim was to break the Portuguese monopoly and secure their share of the slave trade and the mineral wealth of West and Central Africa. To further these ends, they used the blacks as other white peoples did and still do. No time was lost in forming an alliance with Pedro II, King of Congo, in his war with the Portuguese. The Dutch had already captured 7 Portuguese slaves ships at sea, sunk other vessels in the harbors at Luanda and Mpinda, and generally raising hell. All this gave Queen Nzinga more time to prepare for the inevitable. She even reversed her demands for a Portuguese war against the Jaga and formed a military alliance with them herself. Knowing how very unreliable the Jaga were, she sought to make the alliance binding by promising to marry the Jaga chief, Kansanji, and adopting certain desirable Jaga customs. Nzinga's greatest act, however, probably the one that makes her one of the greatest women in history, was in 1624 when she declared all territory in Angola over which she had control as free country, all slaves reaching it from whatever quarter were forever free. She went further, since it was so clear to her that the white power in Africa rested squarely on the use of black troops against black people. She understood the first and only careful organized effort to undermine and destroy the effective employment and use of black soldiers by white. The first and only black leader in history who has ever known to undertake such a task. She had carefully selected groups of her own soldiers to infiltrate the Portuguese black armies, first separating and spreading out individually into Portuguese-held territory and allowing themselves to be induced by Portuguese recruiting agents to join her forces. The quiet and effective work of Nzinga agents among the black troops of Portugal was once the most glorious, yet unsung pages in African history. For whole companies rebelled and deserted to the colors of the Black Queen, taking with them much needed guns and ammunition which she had been unable to secure except by swiftly moving surprise attacks on the enemy units. The Queen's armies were further strengthened by the runaway slaves who streamed into the only certain haven for the free on the whole continent of Africa. To the Portuguese, Queen Nzinga had passed the last word in unheard of audacity when she was able to influence scores of vassals chiefs to rebel against them and join the cause of their own race. This was too much. The woman had to be destroyed. It had to come to that. The Portuguese sent their ultimatum to the Queen from their Luanda strongholds, Portugal's Lisbon in Africa. It demanded the immediate return of all chiefs, soldiers, and slaves to Portuguese territory, that is, all who fled therefrom. Refusal would mean war, the ultimatum concluded. The fact was that a state of war already existed since the Queen's own ultimatum of the previous year. The Portuguese were afraid to move against her then, and there were even more afraid to move against her stronger forces, although they continued to give the Dutch threat as the reason for delaying the required all-out attack. Meanwhile, the usual strategy of first instigating factional strife among the blacks was by no means forgotten. It was just that there was so much unity and patriotism in this dominant Angola state, so much fanatical devotion to this terrible Black Queen, that internal subversion was almost impossible. They tried to overcome all this by formally declaring that Nzinga was not legally queen of Ndongo, the throne vacant, and one of their own vassals, Chief Adi Kalanjuji, was declared king. The Portuguese marshaled all of their forces on the land and sea, their special river fleets in particular, to crush Nzinga before the Dutch struck again. But the Queen herself opened the offense, striking first at the Portuguese puppet king and his forces. The Portuguese captured her principal island stronghold in the Cuanza River in July 1626, thus dividing her queen, cut off her main supporting regiments, and forced her not only to retreat but to withdraw from her country. Joy reigned at Luanda and Sion Thome. With Nzinga's flight from Angola, it appeared that the Black menace was over and victory complete. Adi Kalunji was crowned King Philip I of Ndongo. The solidarity of blacks remained unbroken, however, and their loyalty to Nzinga remained steadfast. She was just away a little while and would soon return. Any child in the most distant bush could tell you that their queen was just away on business. So who was this Philip? His name said he was a Portuguese, so he couldn't be the king of Ndongo. All Angolan kings and queens were so African that they couldn't be tricked out of their own African names. The queen herself had dropped Anne from her name when she discovered that baptizing a black into Christianity meant surrendering his soul and body not to any Christ but to the white man. And oral tradition further has it that the people not only rejected Philip I, but made fun of the very idea that he considered himself to be king. Their blind faith in their queen and the certainty of her return, according to the same oral record, was not really so blind. Those who understood the coded drum messages spread the news that all the guerrilla attacks which occurred throughout the land were attacks which were personally directed by the queen, and that in fact she was raising a new army of liberation. Her loyal chiefs and people in Ndongo were to stand by ready. The written record, no matter how slanted, supports the oral, for in 1627 in November, she crossed the borders back into her country at the head of a strong army, made stronger and stronger as her loyal chiefs and wildly cheering people, including her fanatically devoted freedmen, flocked to her standard as she swept forward to recapture the Cuanza stronghold held by Philip I and put him to flight. The Portuguese continued to be amazed at this display of black unity, and under a woman's leadership at that. Black unity was now seen clearly as black power, and that meant an unconquerable people. The Portuguese were resolved to break that unity and the power that developed from it. The revolt against them had become general as Nzinga's victorious forces advanced. The Portuguese retreated to their own strongholds on the coast, giving the Dutch threat as an excuse and not the threat of being annihilated by the Queen forces. But as there was in fact no imminent Dutch threat, the Portuguese regrouped and strengthened their forces for an all-out war to destroy Nzinga, and this time, not to stop fighting until this was done. They began by giving orders and offering a big reward for her capture, dead or alive. Their slave troops, still the backbone of the Portuguese armed forces, were given the special inducements of land and freedom for her capture. Realizing that an all-out attempt to capture her meant that countless thousands of her people would die in her defense, she outwitted the Portuguese again by slipping out of the country, instructing her lieutenants to spread the word everywhere that she had fled the country and mistakenly entering the territory of an enemy had been killed. To give point to the story, there was general weeping and mourning throughout Ndongo, real weeping and mourning because the masses believed the story to be true. So did the Portuguese. The only reason for the war having been removed by Providence, the bishop could celebrate a special mass in celebration of this special blessing, and the colony of Angola could at least be organized after over 50 years of obstruction. All things now seem to be happy and going well according to the original grand design. Then in 1629, the Portuguese stood aghast when Queen Nzinga burst upon them from the grave. Sweeping all opposition before her, she brought in her fierce Jaga allies, apparently willing to do even this to defeat the whites. The Portuguese were completely defeated. She had not only retaken her own country, but had meanwhile become queen of Matamba also, having replaced the weak queen there. Nzinga was now an empress of two countries. She now redoubled her campaign against slavery and the slave trade by making both Ndongo and Mataba havens for all those who could escape from the slaver by rebelling or otherwise. Chiefs engaged in the traffic in nearby states now stood in all fear of her wrath. The Portuguese saw the handwriting on the wall. In order not to lose every foothold in the area, Lisbon suddenly remembered that it had never carried out the treaty signed with Nzinga in 1622 and declared that Portugal's wars against her had been unjust. High-level embassies were sent to the Queen in 1639 in efforts to effect a settlement. Nzinga received them, listened to their protestations of eternal friendship, and went ahead with determination in reorganizing both of the kingdoms and undermining colonial rule in areas held by the enemy. That every white man in Africa was an enemy of the blacks was a matter about which there was no room for debate in her mind. Even the holy robes of the priests in Angola not only covered their real missions as agents of empire, but also covered their insatiable lust for black bodies of their helpless slave girls. She had been forced by the actualities of black-white relationships to distrust all whites, along with their tricky treaties. In 1641, the Dutch had made great progress in reducing the power of Portugal all along the coast, and Nzinga's adamant position made the situation an impossible one to maintain. A despairing governor and council had no choice but to declare war against her once again, a full-scale war, but the situation was now most favorable for the Angolans. Their northern neighbor, Congo, had become more active in its own war against the Portuguese, and besides, a new and greater king had assumed the leadership. This was Garcia II, who continued the policy of cooperating with the Dutch where and when Congolese interests were involved. Some black leaders had learned to use the whites as the whites always used them when it served their own interests. The other happy development for Ndongo was that the Dutch invasion of Portuguese-held areas had actually begun in 1641 before any moves could be made against either of the two black states, Congo and Ndongo. Nzinga continued her campaign against the Portuguese, winning victories everywhere a battle was joined. With Dutch's aid, the great Portuguese stronghold of Mocengano fell in 1648. The Dutch, having previously captured Luanda, now found themselves threatened by the steady reinforcements that continued to pour in from Portuguese Brazil. The Dutch withdrew, leaving the blacks in the area who had helped them to capture and defend this, the most important Portuguese city in Africa, to fend for themselves alone. While the chiefs and their forces did indeed put up a gallant fight, they were massacred in one of the most savage onslaughts on records. The recapture of Luanda by Salvador de Sá, the new governor, and his crushing of black opposition there led him to initiate new peace efforts with two kingdoms of Congo and Nzinga. The Congolese king refused to answer his letter, but did send a monk to hear the governor's terms. Nzinga also agreed to efforts at negotiations. These gestures by the two African leaders led Salvador de Sá to advise the king of Portugal that all the African states were cowed and their power broken. He knew better, of course, for even the chiefs and their people in his own Portuguese-held territory were still fighting on despite the massacres, and probably because of them. If the Portuguese had been able to conquer either Congo or Ndongo Mataba, no peace offers would have been made. Hadn't they tried it over and over and failed? To be able to conquer both now was out of the question. Again, the old conquest route was invoked. Beguiling smiles and protestations of friendship, finding concrete expressions in negotiations for peace. The language of diplomacy reached its most brilliant heights of deception in those velvety clauses of proposed treaties with the Africans, if they signed them, would be signing themselves and their people into perpetual bondage. This fact was supposed to be assured by the other fact that the relevant clauses were so ambiguous that they could be interpreted in several different ways, in this case in whatever way the Portuguese chose to interpret them. The very same provisions of the treaties could be read and explained to the blacks in such language that it would appear that the Europeans were not only humbling themselves but also proclaiming the outcome as a glorious victory for the Africans. Of course, no blacks, not even Nzinga, was supposed to be intelligent enough to see through all of this. But stripping away all of the glittery verbiage, Nzinga saw at a glance that what it all meant was that she was to be a vassal for the Portuguese king, one paying him a big annual tribute. She would rather die first, and no one should have known this better than the Portuguese, who at the time of this latest treaty offer had been at war with her and repeatedly defeated. For over 28 years, they had met one of the giants of the human race whom they found impossible to recognize as such because she appeared on the planet not only as a woman, but one with black skin. And Nzinga therefore kept them anxiously waiting for action on the treaty, toying with it for 6 years, while giving her war-torn land and tired-out people a period for rest and recovery. She was the same queen who had fled twice from the country, not to save herself, but save her people from a slaughter that her flight would prevent. For the same reason, she did not want the war resumed again after over 40 years of warfare. On the other hand, she would not surrender her country to Portugal and its slave trade. The areas of Angola they still held, including the important islands of Luanda and Sao, belonged to the Angolan people, and some of these areas belonged directly to her own kingdoms of Ndongo and Matamba. Finally, then in 1656, tired and weary from 4 decades of relentless struggles, she signed a treaty that was revised and made acceptable to her. Her greatest concession allowed the Portuguese puppet king, Adi, to have the territory conceded to them. There were several more years of busy life for Queen Nzinga, pushing reconstruction, the resettlement of ex-slaves, and undertaking the development of an economy of free men and women that would be able to succeed without slave trade. She could not have been unaware that the Portuguese still strongly entrenched in the most strategic areas unless she was succeeded by equally great leaders. All of her laborers in defense of the freedom of blacks would ultimately be in vain. That was the burning question in 1663 as a dull autumn sun lengthened The shadows over the palace grounds where 1,000 stood in tears. Were there any more Garcias anywhere? Would God send them another Nzinga to hold the line against the truly white devils? The sun slowly went down by the Angolan trees and darkness spread over the land. Over 300 years later, the blacks of Angola are still fighting the Portuguese and still waiting for the sunrise. In the heart-torn state of national mourning, the Queen's Council permitted 2 priests to come in and perform the last rites of the church. Since the Queen had renounced the Catholic religion many years before her passing and had banned missions from her country as centers of subversions, this appearance of priests at the royal bedside may be explained either at once a Catholic, always a Catholic theory, or as an attempt by Catholic Portugal to give the appearance of final victory on all fronts. In this case, it would mean that the most unconquerable of foes, recanting and submissive, had been conquered by their religion in the end. And so it was written in the official documents of Portugal, the written record used by almost all historians of Africa, that Nzinga had returned to the church that had baptized her. And yet, she was one of the first blacks to see that the Portuguese conquest, the slave trade, and the church were all inseparably one and the same. The long years of warfare had been equally against all three, the unholy trinity, and she had never surrendered. In 1963, 300 years after her death, her people, now Catholic themselves, did not believe she had ever returned to the Catholic Church.